When I made my Insecure Shonen Protagonist video a few months ago, I got some comments asking why I didn't mention Mob Psycho 100. It's a battle story after all, and one of the biggest antagonists in the series is, well, anxiety. Whether it's fears of the future, social awkwardness, a lack of talent, Mob Psycho 100 explores the flaws and concerns of its characters in great detail, and I love it for doing that. As far as insecure protagonists go, Mob's one of the best. But when it comes to insecure shonen protagonists, he doesn't quite fit the mold I'm looking for. The character I desired in that other video was someone who, among other things, wanted power, more battle strength, a better social standing, emotional stability, anything along those lines. Naruto, the talentless outcast with a demonic fox trapped inside of him, was what I considered to be the best depiction of my ideal. And if I were to compare him to Mob under the same metric, that wouldn't change. One just ticks more boxes than the other. In spite of that though, I actually like Mob as a character more than Naruto. Remember how I said in that same video that such a template wasn't the only way to portray anxiety? That not everyone experiences it in the same way? This is where Mob Psycho comes in. It goes in a subtly different direction and excels for doing so. Before I dig too deep into things, let me explain what I mean when I use shonen in this context. Obviously, the term refers to a demographic, a type of audience specific manga and anime are designed to cater towards. There are action and adventure genres, but there is no shonen genre like I've mistakenly said in the past. It's a demographic that can encompass just about anything really. We never learn as shonen, even if it isn't what Western fans would generally think of when they hear the term. But hold on. That sounds like the term has morphed into its own beast over the years, almost as if people have started using it to refer to a certain set of guidelines, or atmosphere. This brings me to The Aura of Shonen, a blog post from the Hunter x Hunter 2011 Dick Riding Association and Cherry Boy writer. I'm not going to cover the whole post here, so I'd advise you to give it a read on your own, but the basic idea is that there are 4 core principles that comprise what the authors refer to as the shonen aesthetic. Optimism, the passing of the torch, empathy, and the belief that power is necessary to achieve one's ambitions. If someone were to ask me what separates a battle series from a shonen battle series, this formula would be my go-to answer. Not only does it add context to the otherwise nebulous appropriation of a word that simply designated an appeal towards young boys, it also offers a launching pad for discussions of how individual titles depict each component. Naturally, these guidelines could also apply to things that aren't shonen, so it's not perfect, but if it gives me an excuse to recommend Hugto Precure in the same breath as One Piece or Naruto, by the gods of Shonen, Togashi, and Oda, I'll take it. For the sake of transparency, Mob Psycho 100 has already been covered on the same blog as the Shonen Aesthetic post, so I'll link that in the description as well. I personally disagree with most of it, but hey, people don't need to share my opinions. That's right boys, I'm gonna promote your work and call you out at the same time. Take that. The reformation of multiple antagonists is enough to highlight how crucial optimism is to Mob Psycho 100, and Season 2 put a strong emphasis on empathy through episodes of Mob learning to check his privilege, and Reigen grappling with his manipulative tendencies, among other cool scenarios. That's all well and good, but what really grabs me in retrospect is the evolution of what was presented in Season 1. Something I neglected in my last video regarding Inherited Will was the need to correct the mistakes of the previous generation, and Mob Psycho 100 leans into that idea hard. The adults in this setting don't really have a strong legacy to pass on. Many of these characters were failed by the generation that preceded them, whether that be the scars of Claw's 7th Division, Serizawa, Sho, and their organization would have failed the next generation as well, if not for people like Mob and Reagan. To paraphrase a statement from the Pedantic Romantics video on the Season 1 climax, children should not be forced to go through great pains to protect themselves in a broken world. It should be the responsibility of adults to shield them from such burdens when necessary. At this stage in his development, when he was just starting to manage his emotions instead of bottling them up, Mob did not have the mental stability to handle the scars on his own. A battle like that during his vulnerable period of self-reflection could have done long-lasting damage to his psyche. Irreversible damage? Perhaps not, but why take that risk? Why put someone through a traumatic experience if there are other ways to help them appreciate the value of what they have? By letting Mob run away and fighting on his behalf, Reagan gave Mob that alternative. As an adult with confidence in his sense of identity, Reagan had the mental resilience to deal with the scars. Not only could he face them head-on without going berserk, but he could even talk them down from their violent ideology. He was simply better equipped to handle the situation. If I had to choose a character who most closely passed on something resembling the will of fire found in stories like Naruto, One Piece, and the like, it would be Reagan. He said he would help Mob learn to use his powers. And even if Reagan wasn't a psychic himself, that's exactly what he did. By guiding and supporting Mob, Reigen stopped him from potentially walking the same path as Teruki or Claw. The difference between his relationship with Mob and that of Suzuki and Serizawa was that Reigen treated Mob like a friend. Serizawa was merely a pawn for Claw's bidding from the start, someone who was looked down on. His mental health was manipulated instead of protected, so even if Serizawa managed to leave his room, his supposed savior had no interest in addressing the root of his problems. The umbrella solution was like putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. It merely hid the damage without actually taking care of the goddamn bullet. Reigen would at the very least address Mob's problems directly. Of course, his actions are partially motivated by selfish reasons as well, but that only becomes an issue when he opposes Mob's best interest.
プライベートってせいぜい筋トレの部活くらいじゃないのか？それかまたデート詐欺か何かに引っかかったのか？すぐ利用されんだから成長しねえなお前はよ。
You get taken advantage of so easily, said by the man who relied on Mob the most. Grow up, said by the con man who made a living pretending to be a psychic. Reigen's influence made Mob a better person, but Reigen made the mistake of assuming his student was still the same helpless boy who had approached him in the past. Even if only for a moment, he assumed that he was in control, that he could walk all over Mob and get away with it, that no matter what happened, Mob would inevitably return. But Mob was not Serizawa. Mob had gained the ability to stand on his 2 feet thanks to Reigen, but he was by no means a subordinate. He couldn't keep relying on his master to guide him down the easy path, and similarly, Reigen couldn't keep relying on his student to keep his business afloat. His overdependence on Mob wasn't just toxic for Mob, it was equally toxic for Reigen himself. He had always wanted to become someone special, to do something grand, but if he kept making Mob do all the work, he wouldn't be doing anything. He wouldn't become special in his own right. The faults of the mentor should not remain unchecked simply because their will is being inherited. It's up to the disciple to right the wrongs of their predecessor, and if possible, the teacher should follow their student's example and change for the better. Lastly, we have the principle of power, something which one seems to reject at face value. Where the typical shonen battle protagonist must attain a certain level of strength to properly impose their ideologies on the world, Mob's story is about not letting himself be defined by his powers alone. Characters who rely solely on their talents are rebuked, and Mob is rewarded for not abusing his strength. If one was to view psychic ability as the power currency of Mob Psycho 100, then yes, it's a story about knowing when to reject power. At the same time, however, there are moments where only his psychic powers can save the day. The first episode of Season 2, his fight with Mogami, his fight with the President of Claw. In 2 of those cases, Mob initially avoids using his abilities and tries to be diplomatic, but where his psychic activities were presented as shortcomings in Season 1, that's not the case here. It's okay to run away, but you can't run away forever. Sometimes it's necessary to stand your ground and fight back. Mob Psycho 100 isn't just a story about rejecting power, it's a story about controlling power. And while in some cases that does mean holding back, in others, it means going all out. In the face of overwhelming might, pacifism won't always measure up. Such ideals are good to strive for, but humans aren't simple enough for the same solution to work 100% of the time. This brings me to the crossroads of what could be considered the 2 power currencies of Mob Psycho 100, psychic strength and mental health. I made all those jokes about power scalers, and now I've become one. Mob may possess an unrivaled psychic power, but his lack of success came down to his weak mental health. The 2 were inversely proportional at first, so when Mob was emotionally stable, his power was restrained. When his emotions ran wild and his mental strength depleted, his powers took over. His psychic prowess wasn't a liability in and of itself, but the lack of synergy made him dangerous. One could look at the outcome of the Teruki fight and call it a contradiction of the show's pacifist philosophy, as after all, Mob's powers were necessary to give Teru an ego check. But that's not really what happened here. Mob's victory helped Teru self-actualize in an all-around healthier way. But as Season 2 showed, Mob had the potential to teach Teru that lesson on his own. Conflict was the correct path here. Mob just wasn't ready to walk it yet. His inability to process his emotions and own his talent was his true failing. The difference between this fight and the Season 1 climax was whether or not Mob had someone who could fight in his place. And the difference between those fights and the Season 2 climax was Mob's faith in himself. The leader of Claw acts as a brilliant contrast to the incompetent 7th Division. Where the Scars had strong psychic powers but exploitable mental insecurities, their boss had achieved a strong sense of self-actualization. It came at the expense of everyone he crossed paths with, but he wasn't a pushover like the broken adults he manipulated. Reagan couldn't out-mental health him, and he sure didn't have the physical strength to win. The only one capable of matching the boss's abilities was Mob. But unlike before, where he could only supply the telekinesis, he now had the self-confidence to fend for himself and avoid succumbing to an animalistic battle lust. Power is a double-edged sword. One needs it to ensure their voice is heard, to impose their will on others, but that desire can easily lead to ego and tyranny. Sho's father used his power to exploit others, but Mob used his power to defend and reform. Pacifism was his go-to, but when faced with someone as confident as Suzuki, his emotional growth wasn't enough.
悔しいけど、僕じゃ力不足だ。何か別の道をあんたに示すほどの力はない。
Any one person can be reasoned with no matter their circumstances, but that doesn't mean just any one person or method can prove successful. Mob and his friends might not have had the awareness to talk down the Scars, but Reagan did. Serizawa's family didn't have the patience or experience to deal with his anxiety, but Mob did. These disputes were resolved through words, but if the protagonist lacked power, there wouldn't have been a discussion in the first place. Conversely, the confrontations with Teruki and Mogami were resolved through violence because Mob couldn't connect with them ideologically. Perhaps someone else could have pacified them, but no such person was involved in the clash. Mob had to use the tools at his disposal, lest he do nothing at all and be crushed. Sometimes, you have to attack to defend. This wraps back around to the final fight, where despite gaining control of his emotions, control of his strength, Mob could not talk down Suzuki peacefully, nor could he prevent the man from self-destructing. Mob did not have the experience or the conviction to talk down a man who had spent 20 years traveling the world, preparing this massive amount of power, this massive army, for his goal of world conquest. How could someone like that, with such conviction behind his ideals, be talked down peacefully by someone like Mob? But then again, nobody else could match him in terms of psychic power. Mob was the only one who could approach him. As such, he chose the other option, to fight for what he cared for. But even after the battle that ensued, he didn't abandon his enemy, and that decision saved the day. He might not have been able to guide his foe down a new path personally, but he at least gave Suzuki a chance to start over and redeem himself. The difference between Mob and the characters I explored in my previous video is that Mob's personal growth isn't matched by his power. They're connected for sure, but not in the same escalating way that I want to see. His psychic abilities don't change, and that's kind of the point of his journey. Mob knowingly comes from a place of privilege, both in terms of his power and his environment. He doesn't have to train to become the strongest Esper. Though I guess if we're still running with the alternative reading, you could say he goes through mental health training arcs. In other words, the narrative focus is more on his character development and less his power. Whereas a different shonen story, the one I'm looking for, focuses on the character development and the growth of power. Naruto's hidden strength, for example, is the source of his exclusion from society, whereas Mob's talent gets an indifferent reaction. He starts with a family and Reagan to assist him, where Naruto has to fight to earn his relationships. The general messages behind both titles aren't that different, and as I was going through this script, I could even piece together similar plot points. But slight alterations can make a world of difference. That's what makes media interesting. It's why I enjoy the series. But it's also why Mob doesn't scratch the same itch that Naruto does. I'm not criticizing Mob Psycho for this, just clearing things up. I tried to get at this idea before with Bleach, but I like it when different creators have different ways of storytelling. People like to judge things by specific conventions, but I'd find it boring if every story adhered to the same rules. I may have a bias towards liking action-adventure stuff, and it's fun to look at the recurring tropes and messages found in a publication like Weekly Shonen Jump. But if a piece of media can do enough to interest me, I'm willing to put in the effort to match its wavelength. So yeah, Mob Psycho's a good show, Naruto's a good show, Shonen Jump has a lot of cool shit, take care of your mental health, and that's the video. I didn't actually write a proper ending to this. I don't know. I felt like it could have been more conclusive, but I just kind of ended there. Special thanks to King Kevin 30, Stone Cold 007, Roggle, Jackerknife, Potato Gaming HD, and all of my other patrons for supporting videos like these. Man, if we want to talk about trying to get on a certain wavelength to try to match what a series is putting down, stay tuned for my 35-part analysis on the Monogatari franchise. God, this is my background as a wrestling fan coming in, because I'm like a promoter. Gotta hype it up because it's like a pay-per-view. Like, oh, you gotta buy it. You gotta support me on Patreon for these projects. I don't know why I do this, but I do it all the time. If you ever want extra content from me, if you don't think I upload enough here and you just want to hear more of the sound of my voice or whatever, check out my side channel where I do the Nen Show podcast with Craftsdorf. We're about to start Fairy Tail. I don't know why I said about to start, because when I post this video, we will have started Fairy Tail. So that's coming up. But then we got Togashi after that, so we got Yu Yu Hakusho and Hunter x Hunter, and that'll round out the year, so that'll be cool. But then there's also just any random tangent video rambles I make. Sometimes I post manga unboxings there, because I buy manga sometimes. We're done. That's it. Bye.